Remember that beautiful early September day 20 years ago, how blue the sky was. There was hardly a cloud on the horizon. In many parts of the country, there was just a touch of fall in the air, a promise of cooler weather to come. Our country was prosperous and at peace, although there was still some resentment on the political left over the Supreme Court decision that cleared the way for the George W. Bush presidency. Around the country, Unitarian Universalist congregations were gearing up for their new church year, many of them planning a water ceremony for that Sunday. In most places, school had started and children were in their classes. And then everything changed. In preparing for this service for today, it was tempting to me to go back and use portions of my original 9/11 sermon, the one I delivered 20 years ago at the UU Church of Chattanooga. My sermon on September 16th, 2001 was entitled Questions and Fears. In it, I lifted up some of the many questions running through my mind, and I urged my congregation not to give in to their fears. Reading it over now, I see that so much of what I had feared for our country actually did come to pass. 20 years after that fateful day, we have only just ended the war in Afghanistan, borrowing $2 trillion that our children and grandchildren will have to pay back in order to lose over 6,000 total American lives, military and contract workers, killing 66,000 Afghan military and police members, and over 47,000 Afghan civilians, thus inspiring more young people around the world, disaffected and unhappy, to join terrorist groups. Today's young adults born since 2001 have never known a time our country was not at war. Luckily, in my original sermon, I was completely wrong about a reestablishment of a military draft, but now that is cold comfort. After 20 years of constant war, the Middle East is no closer to some semblance of peace, and millions of people have lost homes, livelihoods, and loved ones, and they blame the United States. 20 years later, we seem no closer to understanding all the myriad factors that make up the conflicts in the post-colonial Arab world. 20 years later, what had begun at the end of the Clinton presidency as a national surplus was spent and spent and spent until today our country is nearly $29 trillion in debt. If you want to scare yourself, you can go on the internet and check the real-time national debt clock and watch the numbers speed upwards. 20 years later, bigotry, prejudice, and violence against Muslims and Arabs and people who are mistaken as Muslim and Arabs is endemic in our country still. 20 years later, perhaps emboldened by the Trump presidency, in many parts of the country, we seem to be a people deeply divided by fear of the unknown, fear of difference, fear of brown-skinned people, fear that something bad is going to happen again, fear so great and pervasive that so many people are willing to countenance almost any curtailment of freedom to gain a sense of security. Interestingly, due to the way the pandemic has been politicized, the life-saving vaccine and mask wearing to prevent disease are seen by some on the right as curtailment of vital freedoms, while the vast internal security system deployed against our own citizens since 9/11 does not seem to bother them. 20 years later, parents of South Asian, Arab, Sikh, and Muslim background find themselves having the talk with their children, much like the talk that many Black parents have had to have with their children in order to keep them safe in their dealings with law enforcement and authority figures. The talk is about racial profiling, about what these young people post on their social media accounts, and about the dangers of speaking their language of origin in public. 20 years later, far too many people believe that patriotism means not criticizing our country, that loving our country equals refusing to admit there could be any serious national flaws, whether historical or in the present. The moral panic over critical race theory, something only taught the second year of law school, if taught at all, is but a symptom of the feeling that America cannot be seen as wrong, ever, ever. 20 years later, far too many people think they should report their neighbors for being Muslim, report their airplane seatmates for speaking Arabic, call the police because they see a brown man they don't know on the street. 20 years later, we are still having congressional arguments over fixing our country's rusting and broken infrastructure, from roads to bridges, to dams and levees, to airports and ports and the electric grid. The consequences of that lack of maintenance and repair in essential infrastructure are seen in floods in the Midwest, on the Gulf Coast, in the Northeast, nearly 2 weeks without power in Louisiana following the collapse of a transmission tower that when you see it, it's a rusting hulk of rubble. It is clearly not a tower that has been properly maintained and kept to standard. There are collapsed bridges in Minnesota, poisoned water in Michigan, closed overpasses all over the country, trillions available for war, but trillions to fix what's wrong at home is wasteful spending and socialism. The news is not all terrible. 20 years ago, even in cities with lots of interfaith connection, there was generally very little outreach to the Muslim community. 20 years later, we find that many, if not most, of the liberal Christian and Unitarian Universalist churches and the Jewish congregations are now in relationship with Muslim congregations in their vicinity. Even here at our home, we had established close ties with the New Medina Islamic congregation before the pandemic. 20 years later, many congregations speak out against anti-Muslim prejudice whenever and wherever they find it. Unfortunately, they keep finding it. 20 years later, more and more of us of all faiths speak up for our Muslim and Hindu and Sikh neighbors, refusing to accept their being targeted for their religious or national origins. Compared to the 90% of Americans who in the fall of 2001 told pollsters they favored retaliation even if civilian populations were harmed, 20 years later, more and more Americans are expressing open concern about indiscriminate civilian casualties. More and more Americans are becoming aware that endless war and drone strikes harm us, harm our military, leaving veterans coping with wounds that are both physical and psychological, damaging widening circles of military families beyond those sent away to fight. More and more Americans are coming to understand what I wrote 20 years ago. We can never amass enough firepower to kill everyone who hates us, especially if we do nothing to stop the causes. And even if we could do so, it would be immoral. 20 years later, this is still true. We have to find another way to live in this world so damaged by legacies of colonialism and exploitation and racism. 20 years later, questions of how we best love our country arise still. Congress declared September 11th Patriot Day starting in 2002, but that begs the question, who is a patriot? The dictionary says a patriot is a person who supports and defends their country, and thus all who serve in the military, including those in our congregation, are patriots. But in the same way that a loving, caring parent would want to work with a beloved child to correct shortcomings, a patriot, a person who loves their country, has a duty to help work on their country's growing edges and faults. Wholeness and health cannot be achieved either in individuals or in countries that refuse to admit there might be a problem. 20 years later, it seems we have learned some things and not learned others. But it seems clear that hatred and intolerance breed more hatred and intolerance, that fear is corrosive, that ignorance is dangerous, that war and high-tech weapons cannot solve the challenge of international terrorism, and that terrorism domestically, based in nationalism and racism, is a bigger threat to our country than anything internationally. And it's so clear that our poor, suffering world needs love, compassion, and understanding more than ever before. We are not the country that we were on September 10th, 2001. In many ways, we are a worse country, riven by divisions and nursed on lies. But this does not have to be our fate. We can accept that there's no such thing as perfect safety and work to manage our expectations. We can learn and practice nonviolent communications and the ways of dealing with conflict in our lives, in our congregations, in our work, in our communities. We can continue to reach out to communities of color and our Muslim neighbors to establish and nurture reciprocal relationships, to understand the issues they deal with and learn how we can best support them. We can use our right to vote to choose candidates at all levels that do not utilize fear in order to be elected. Candidates whose campaigns express confidence in American and UU values of openness, tolerance, inclusion, and democracy. I want us to be the country envisioned in the words that opened this service. I close with words from my colleague and friend, Art Severance. May our religion be all religion, our citizenship an interdependent world. May all the deaths inspire us to work toward world peace, to share the riches of our country, to have the courage to be patient, and to find ways besides violence, and to continue to live love and tolerance. May these events of 9/11 remind us that any day could be our last, and of the importance of loving relationships with each other, with our families, in our country, and in our world. Amen, Ashe, Shalom, Salam, Namaste. Blessed be.